Hi, everybody. Julie here. I'm very happy, very excited to be with Senior Litigation Counsel from the Democracy Fund this morning, Mark Joseph. I can't tell you guys, we have this amazing team of in-house lawyers, and I just can't tell you how hard they work every day and how much worse things would be in Canada right now without them. And I'm so grateful for their work. The big thing they're doing right now is they're participating in the Public Order Emergency Commission, which you're probably all familiar with if you're watching this video. We're starting day 6. Mark, thanks so much for joining us. I'd love it if you could give us a little update. Can you just let us know, like, what have we learned over the first 5 days of the commission? What are some of the big revelations, the high water marks? What impression is it leaving you with so far?
Well, it's early days. I think we're only on day 6, so it's hard to get a sense of uh, really what's been going on and where it's going to be going. But we did have some interesting testimony from a couple of the city residents who described how the protest impacted their lives. And then we moved on to some city personnel, and they described their efforts to deal with the influx of protesters. And what we're finding is there's some infighting, which we didn't anticipate, I guess, between some of the city representatives and the police services, because they have different interests. And because this is a commission that is supposed to discern the reasonable basis for the invocation of the emergency. So we thought it was going to be a binary hearing. On one side, you'd hear the civil liberties groups, and the other side, you'd hear the government. And one side would claim the invocation was unnecessary, unreasonable, and the other side would say no, it was reasonable and necessary. But it's more complicated and nuanced than that. So that's been interesting, I think, for us.
Mhm.
Of course, our position remains the same, that it was likely, I would say, unlawful and unreasonable, but the commission will come to its own conclusions.
When you say that it's showing that there was some infighting on the government side, are you suggesting that there was some confusion during the time of the convoy, over what was going on and what they should do about it, sort of a lack of communication? Or do you think there really was informed and um, decided disagreement about whether or not the emergency order should be invoked, like on the part of the OPP versus the RCMP versus the Prime Minister's office versus the mayor's office versus city councillors?
That's an interesting question, and I think we'll learn more as it plays out. I mean, it's hard to say. I think it's fair to say that it was a chaotic environment for all the representatives of all levels of government, uh,
Mhm.
as well as for the police services. And then the plan they had for prior protests wasn't going to work because those protests were limited in size. I think one of the government workers said they had usually dealt with protests small in size, and they were about 99 to 100 per year.
Mm.
And then these protests come and then they leave fairly quickly. But this protest, I think Chief slowly said he anticipated they would come and go quickly, like by Monday or something. They're just there for the weekend. But it became apparent quickly that these protesters were committed to stay a little bit longer than that,
Mm.
and their grievances were broader than simply, it was going to be encompassed in one weekend.
Mhm.
Um, so that led to some confusion. I think it's fair to say, between all levels of government, and we're now seeing that play out in the emails and the phone calls and the testimony that's being presented.
During the convoy, we didn't see anyone from any level of government or police services suggest any indication that they were willing really to meet with the convoy organizers. Is there any suggestion during the commission so far that there may have been some disagreement about that anyone may have wanted to meet with them to negotiate, to have a more peaceful, civil discourse about what their grievances were?
That's also an interesting question. I mean, maybe you picked up on it, maybe your viewers
Mhm.
did, but there was a suggestion by one of the, I think, city councilors, um, that the government, I think it was the Ontario government, they had a mediator at least set up, or there was some discussion about a mediator,
Hmm.
that they might use to contact the protesters and seek a resolution. And that I think was brought before Mr. Mendocino, and the federal government's response was that I believe they're not interested in a mediator for this process. So that was the city of Ottawa was interested. I think the provincial government might have been interested, but the federal government scotched that idea. That's my understanding. I think I want to go back and check that. Um, but yes, to answer your question, there was some discussion at some levels of government that a mediator be used to resolve the protests, and obviously that didn't happen.
Well, that's a very interesting telling fact, isn't it? And it'll be interesting to see if, as the commission goes on, if that holds true, and if, in fact, Justin Trudeau appears as a witness, if what he has to say about that. Because if we're in a place in Canada where members of the community or Canadians are organizing themselves en masse in an act of peaceful civil disagreement, and our federal government is saying, as a matter of principle, we will not meet with you or talk with you. That's a pretty significant place we've gotten to in Canada, isn't it? And I want to ask you, it was really interesting. I was able to watch all of the testimony from the last witness yesterday, Pat Morris, OPP superintendent, and he had some really interesting things to say. As we're seeing, I mean, this commission, is it gone over every day? It's a long day, isn't it? And I think it's a testament to the endurance of the lawyers from all parties, the commissioner, the witnesses. But he struck me as being a very sympathetic, balanced, reasonable, informed, careful, conscientious sort of person. And he had some very interesting telling things to say, both about surveillance and about the role of the media and the government in generating a certain impression of the convoy. Can you speak to that a little bit? Our senior, or our chief litigator, director of litigation, Alan Honner, uh, examined him, and I thought did a masterful job. And maybe you could tell everybody, just walk us through how that examination went and what we found out from Superintendent Morris.
Yeah, in my opinion, that's been the most interesting testimony. So if your viewers want to, review one part of the commission so far, I would say go to Inspector Morris's testimony, because he, as you say, I found him very measured um, and careful in his answers, and he said some interesting things. So he was the OPP officer, I believe, in charge of collecting and reviewing the intelligence that came in about the protests and the convoy. And so you would think that he would be privy to a lot of sensitive information. And remember, the commission is there, at least in part, to find out whether or not the invocation of the emergency order was reasonable. And so there's a test in the Emergencies Act that the government must meet to justify its invocation. And that has a lot to do with whether or not this was a national emergency, whether there were any other laws of Canada that can deal with this, whether there was indications of foreign influence, sabotage, espionage, that really crippled the country and made it impossible for the government to carry on its business.
Mhm.
Those aren't the exact words, but you can go to the Emergency Acts and see for yourself. And so his testimony basically, I guess it showed the problem the government's going to have, because he suggested that there was he said the absence of criminal activity, at least as the convoy was progressing toward Ottawa, was shocking. I think that was the word he used. Um, and then he suggested that there was no evidence of all those things I suggest you needed to invoke the Emergencies Act. There was no evidence of espionage, sabotage, foreign influence, um, the disruption and the violence that the government would need to justify invoking the emergency order. So that's problematic for the government, I think. And it was funny when he was finished testifying that I think Justice Rouleau actually said, "Well, that puts the pressure on the government."
Mhm.
So everyone in the room knew what went on when he gave his testimony on that issue. And the other interesting thing he said was that from where he was sitting, as he was listening to the public discourse, he found that it was, I think he said, highly politicized and
Mhm,
sensational. And he was pressed on that by Alan Honner, our litigation director. Um, and Superintendent Morris suggested that it might be coming from public actors. He was asked if he meant the mainstream media, and he was careful. He didn't specifically say it was the mainstream media that was making these sensationalized, politicized claims. Um, but he did say that he was disturbed by that discourse.
mhm.
Um,
Well,
and go
sorry, yeah,
ahead.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that he's the first witness to really bring that forth, and it's something that I
Mhm,
think a lot of people, probably a lot of your viewers, noted. I think just one point, he did say the claims that Russia was involved, or Trump was involved, or a foreign government was involved.
mhm.
He said he had no evidence for. Uh, from where he was sitting, and he was the man gathering and analyzing a lot of the intelligence.
It's very interesting, isn't it? And even though he may not have explicitly stated that it was, the media's fault, if we look at the testimony from Jim Watson, no, these are kind of interesting characters, I think, because Superintendent Morris almost, now maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it almost seemed to me as though he was unburdened by his testimony, that he was quite happy to be able to talk about the significant and problematic influence of the government and the media's propaganda surrounding the convoy. But a day before that, when Alan examined Mayor Jim Watson, he seemed quite reluctant to do that, as though he was, protecting the media. And when Alan questioned him, where are you getting these claims that there were masks being ripped off or that there were acts of violence that were part of the convoy? And very reluctantly, Mayor Watson said that, well, I saw it on the news. And so it's very interesting that in these are very, very well-positioned, prominent decision makers, the convoy, and they had very different takes on the validity, the credentials, the carefulness, the justification of what was appearing in the news at the time. I want to ask you, I know we have to run, but I just want to ask you before we go, what are you excited about for the last few days this week of the commission? Is there anything that's on the horizon that you're going to be looking at really carefully?
Um, that's a good question. I haven't had a lot of time to look at the witness list in
It's coming
advance.
fast and furious, isn't it? It's like we were saying yesterday how so much of the process is a bit of a mystery, and we know a list of the witnesses, but we don't know exactly when they're appearing or who will examine them. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes witnesses take more time than the commission
Hmm.
anticipates, and they have to reschedule things. So you're not exactly sure. It makes it hard to prepare for cross examination. But I will say that we're looking for evidence of, as you say, violence, um, things that affect the national interest. That's the basis upon which the government has to invoke the declaration. So
Hmm.
witnesses that are talking or speaking to those issues are going to be really important. Um, and so that's what we're looking for. We're looking, as you say, if someone said, "Well, there was violence there," we want to press them on that. Okay, where did you get that information? And a lot of times, as you mentioned, it's through the media. And now we just had this witness say, "Well, a lot of the media's information was actually sensationalized and politicized," and I think that's important. I'm just going
Hmm.
off track a little bit, but I think that's important because you recall the government is proposing to bring forward a bill that will sanction um, tech companies for quote spreading disinformation. So the question is, we've where was the information in this situation coming from? Was it coming from, say, regular folks, or was it coming from mainstream media and even the government itself? That's I think a really interesting question in light of these proposed bills that would sanction misinformation. So sorry, I answered another question there. Go back to your original point. I'm not sure exactly who's coming up, but those are the interesting
Yeah.
questions that we want answers to.
I wanted to ask you, and we don't have time today, but maybe we'll chat again next week. But I want to ask you when we do chat next about the difference between fear and demonstrated violence, right? Whether or not citizens feeling fearful is enough to warrant invocation of the emergency order. Maybe we can chat about that next time. Mark, thank you so much. I know that every time you have to do one of these interviews, it takes away from doing important work in other respects, and we really appreciate it because a public inquiry, I mean, this is one of the great acts of a democracy, isn't it? Where we get to see what was behind what the supposed justification was for limiting our civil liberties. And it's so important that we as citizens do our best to understand that and that we hold the government to a very high standard for proof and justification. So thank you so much. I'm sure we'll check in with you again. The Democracy Fund has been officially granted standing in the inquiry, and we want to know the real reason the federal government invoked the Emergencies Act that infringed the fundamental freedoms of Canadians. With your support, our lawyers will be in Ottawa for the next few weeks, trying to hold our government accountable for its improper declaration of an emergency. To follow our work in the inquiry, visit thedemocracyfund.ca/commission, and please consider making a tax-deductible donation to help contribute to our fight. We thank you so much for your support.